And here we go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is an award-winning author whose best-selling book, The Genie in Your Genes, has been hailed by reviewers as a breakthrough in our understanding of the link between emotions and genetics. He founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare to study and implement promising evidence-based psychological and medical techniques. His groundbreaking research has been published in prestigious scientific journals. He is the editor of Energy Psychology, Theory, Research, and Treatment, and a blogger for the Huffington Post. His next book, Mind to Matter, The Astonishing Science of How Your Brain Creates Material Reality, will be published by Hay House in June. Welcome to the show, Dr. Dawson Church.
Matt, good to be here. Thanks for having me. I know we'll have fun in the next hour.
Yeah, I'm so excited. You know, it's funny because you're like, I have an hour. And I was like, oh, man, you have so much stuff. I would just sit here and listen for 10 hours. So let's dive right in and tell people about what you're working on, a little bit about your background.
Well, I have been intrigued by the whole idea of healing for a long time. When I was 15 years old, I joined a spiritual community. And it's ironic because my wife was at Woodstock. She was at the Woodstock, when she was 15 years old, she was there at Woodstock. When I was 15 years old, I was meditating and I was reading the works of what's called the Great Tradition, all the great masters of spirituality throughout the ages. And so we have very different paths, and yet, you know, they all converge at a certain point. So I was really intrigued by the whole idea of healing. I took my first class in hands-on healing. And so there are many kinds of hands-on healing, like Reiki and Jo-Ray. I learned one called attunement, and these are powerful healing techniques, and there's lots of research now showing that these are effective. But all through my 20s, 30s, 40s, these kinds of techniques were thought to be really, well, they were called complementary or alternative medicine, i.e. you use them as a complement to real medicine, which was technological medicine, drugs and surgery, or they were alternatives. So maybe if everything else had failed, then you went and used alternative medicine once conventional medicine couldn't do anything more for you. And so this whole idea that these kinds of techniques were way off there, and they were an optional add-on to real healing, which occurred in hospitals and clinics and places like that. And what began to happen, especially with the wonderful work by the mindfulness and meditation community, was initially in the 1970s and then the 80s, more so in the 90s. There was this research into meditation, and it began to show that these kinds of quote-unquote alternative methods had effects in the body. And then psychological research showed that they had effects on the mind and in the brain. And so people began to act differently. And so, for instance, in one study I did the study in the early 2000s, and it's called the Healthcare Worker Study. And it eventually involved 5 groups of doctors and nurses and chiropractors and psychotherapists and people like that. And in these 5 groups, we did 1 day of a method called EFT, or tapping with them. So we did 1 day of tapping intensively with these healthcare workers. And there were levels of psychological distress in the form of anxiety, depression, phobias, PTSD. Their levels of distress dropped by 45% in 1 day. I mean, that's a massive result. So now meditation, mindfulness, tapping, various other kinds of approaches are showing that they're not just feel-good techniques, they're having real effects psychologically. And the newest research is the effects that they're having biologically. So I've sort of gone along with this for this long ride over the last 40 years, initially being a meditator, being into energy healing, then being in alternative medicine, and now more and more being in conventional medicine. I'll be training people in a couple of weeks in a big clinic near Cleveland. I'll be training people at the New York Open Center soon. I'll be training people at Esalen Institute. And so more and more these what were thought to be far out techniques are making their way into modern medicine. And I've done a lot of research to try and validate them in terms that medical professionals will understand. So that's been my sort of long sweep of my trajectory, is putting a scientific background behind energy healing. So these methods aren't just energy in some kind of ephemeral way. They're energy that we can measure with an MRI machine or an EEG, and show that as you do these techniques, you're having huge shifts psychologically, spiritually, and biologically.
That's incredible, man. I love it. I appreciate your work. It reminds me of Bruce Lipton. I forget what the title is, his books, but it's basically how your consciousness can control or manipulate your genes. So you know, your first book, you have what is it called again? It's a really cool title, The Genie in Your Genes, which is really neat.
Yes.
Do you want to cover a little bit of that book or some of the lessons that you've learned, or do you want to, because I know that you've done this for 40 years, so maybe you can help guide me in where we go, or do you want to talk about your new book and some of the things you discovered with that one?
Well, the new book really the old book paves the way for the new book. The old book was called The Genie in Your Genes. It's about the science of epigenetics, and every single word of that book is relevant because the book was written 15 years ago, but I update the book every 3 to 5 years with the newest science. And so the newest edition is 4 years old, and it shows that our states of mind, our states of heart, our spiritual practices, meditation, tapping, energy therapies, energy medicine, are affecting us at the level of the genes. And this was revolutionary 15 years ago. I mean, no one was thinking this, was talking about this. Bruce Lipton wrote the book, The Biology of Belief, and he talked about how these effects were possible. What I did in The Genie in Your Genes was show that they're measurable. And so he took studies and showed how emotions are literally shifting the expression of your genes. And a simple example is your stress genes. We have two main ones: cortisol and adrenaline are our main stress hormones. And when you have a stressful event, if you hear a loud noise, if you have have an unpleasant interaction with the person around you, you'll have a rise in cortisol. But what research also shows that if you remember that event later on, so maybe you had a dog snarl and bark at you in the park over the weekend, and you had a big panic moment as a result of that real seeming threat to your survival, with this dog barking and its jaws opening and it looked terrifying. So there was a real threat, possible threat to your survival, and you had a rise in adrenaline and cortisol. And that's a objective threat that is affecting you at the level of your biology. And so what Bruce showed in Biology Belief is that our body is translating those external events in the environment into inner environmental signals, which then can trigger a cascade of effects on our body. In The Genie in Your Genes, I showed that effect extends down to the level of which genes are being turned on and being turned off. So that was the big idea I had 15 years ago. And it was a very powerful idea. And now, when I wrote the book, I was just saying, hey, this has got to be true. We can see that if your cortisol is rising, then the genes that code for cortisol must be being turned on as well. This was an obvious proposition to make. By the time I wrote the second edition of the book a few years later, there were 12 studies that showed that. There was 0 when I began. And then by the time I wrote the third edition of the book, there were hundreds of studies showing that emotions and states affect genes. So we know now that genes are affected by the environment, and that includes the emotional environment. When you talk about the dog, day later, 6 months later, a year later, if you're still emotionally triggered, you're having that same rise in cortisol or adrenaline, and you're having that same kind of genetic response with those genes being turned on. And that's okay if it's mild. If it's major, if you were abused as a child, if you're used to having your cortisol and survival genes turned on over and over and over again, then you get stuck at this high level of gene expression for those stress genes. And that is not harmless in your body. In The Genie in Your Genes, I show and list studies showing that if you have high cortisol over time, you have loss of muscle mass, you have loss of bone density, you have loss of the ability to turn short-term into long-term memories, so memory degradation, learning impairments in your body, you have skin wrinkling, you have a shorter lifespan. All kinds of bad things happen if you're highly stressed and can't turn off that stress response. And so I've already been promoting these techniques like tapping, like acupressure, like time in nature, like grounding, like yoga, that center you in your body and help you overcome your stress. So that was sort of where I've been going for the last many years. But then I began to think about, we document these effects in our bodies, but are they affecting the world around us? Are they affecting things outside of the body? And one of the main little nudges I had about this is my wife and I keep a journal. And we just, as we travel, as we meet people, as we do things, and we rewrite stories in our journal. So I have a personal journal, then we have this relationship journal. As we travel, we notice things happening around us. And we were just struck by how many synchronicities happen. Like, it's just uncanny how many synchronicities happen. Like, one day we were in Paris, France. Now, we don't speak French. Then we were in Paris. And we were in an area that was really kind of very modern and bleak looking. There wasn't much, all modern buildings, wasn't much information there. And we were looking for a restaurant to eat at. So we're standing there looking at this, they have these maps in Paris called Plan de Quartier. It's just a map of the local area. And we're standing there looking at this map, wondering where to get a really good dinner. And suddenly this woman walks up to us and says, "Hey, I want to let you know, there's a fantastic Persian restaurant 2 blocks away from here." And I'm scratching my head and thinking, okay, how did she know we spoke English? We're standing there looking at the map there, but she has no idea where we're from Bulgaria or from Australia. But she begins speaking English to us, and she starts answering the question that we had not yet asked her about, where's a great place to eat? And she raved about this Persian restaurant. We wound up going there, and it really was good. But just synchronous things like that happen to us all the time. So we began writing a big S in our journal. And I began to think about synchronicities, and I thought about, maybe our thoughts, our intentions, our beliefs, our worldviews are affecting the world around us. So just as kind of a whimsical project, I began to interview other scientists on my radio show about mind to matter. How is it possible for our minds and our intentions to literally create effects, not just biologically in our bodies? We know that our thoughts can create hormones and enzymes and gene expression, but can our thoughts literally affect the world around us? And I wasn't sure that was true, but now in my new book, Mind to Matter, I quote over 400 scientific studies. You don't have to read them all. Just if you read the book, you'll see what they tell you, because I read the stuff that's really hard to understand. These big, bright ideas from these bold, genius brains. But then I realized that most people around me, my wife won't understand that paper. My mother-in-law won't understand that paper. Our house cleaner won't understand that paper. So I had to write it in a way that the housekeeper can understand. And that's what if you're a science writer, that's what you do. So I write these things in simple ways. And the stories of people who have had these experiences are so profound and moving. One woman, for example, her name is Wanda Birch. I tell her story in the first chapter of the book. And she had a dream that she had cancer. She had breast cancer. And so she went to see her doctor, made an appointment, went to see her doctor. Doctor gave her a thorough examination, and her doctor said to her, "Wanda, you have no sign of breast cancer." They gave her all these tests, and the doctor said, there's no sign of breast cancer whatsoever. Okay. And Wanda was insistent. She said, "I had a dream, and in my dream, I know it's breast cancer. I dreamed there was a ledge, like a rock stone ledge, and there was a pile of debris under the ledge, and that's where the cancer is in my body." So her doctor, who's a wonderful OB-GYN, said to her, "Okay, I want you to show me on your breast exactly where that pile of debris is under the ledge." So Wanda pointed to exactly where she visualized that pile of debris being under the ledge on her breast. So the doctor took a biopsy needle and put a biopsy needle in there and took a sample of tissue out of Wanda's breast that same day, sent it off to the lab, and it turned out that she had a very aggressive, very fast-growing, and virtually undetectable soft cell breast cancer growing right in the spot, tiny little spot that she had dreamed of. Now, how do our minds create these kinds of synchronicities in the world around us? How do we get these messages from the universe? Where are they coming from? Parts of them are from our bodies. Other things are from outside of ourselves. An example of that is there are several Qigong masters, and they can take water. Now, this substance, our bodies are 70% water. The planet is 70% water on its surface. So water is all around us. We just take H2O for granted. But water is a miraculous substance. And so in one amazing piece of research, the investigators took water and they measured the angle at which it bonds. And of course, everyone knows what the chemical formula is for water. It's H2O. So it's basically a big oxygen molecule with two little hydrogen molecules that branch off it. And that angle has been measured by science for a century. The molecular angle of that molecule, it's 104.5 degrees. So they knew when they looked at the water, they'd find that molecular bonding angle between the oxygen and the two hydrogens of 104.5 degrees. But when they looked at water that had been blessed by a healing touch, therapeutic touch, when that healer had held the water in her hands or in his hands, that bonding angle changed. When that water was later used to water plants, in some of the early experiments in this field, the water that had been blessed by the healer, those plants germinated. The seeds that the healer had, the seeds were watered with that water, more of those seeds germinated than in the control group, and the plants grew twice as fast and twice as big as in the group that hadn't been treated. So that water was having big effects on biological systems. So literally our energy fields and our thoughts, our beliefs, especially if our minds are focused and coherent, those are having big effects on the world around us. And as I pieced together all the science behind this, I found literally hundreds of studies showing that we don't just affect the cells of our bodies, like those cortisol and gene expression studies. We literally affect the stuff of the world around us.
That is epic, man. I appreciate you doing that research. I really like the one with the plants because that's really fascinating. And, there's ideas that like plants are conscious, things like that. So what I'd like to ask you then is I have heard that we're creating our reality, extremely quickly, like fractal. Does this corner store exist until I get over to the corner store? And then what's happening? It's kind of being created as I move along. Does your work go into simulation theory and things like that? Like where you're saying we're creating a reality from the mind. So where does that get into as far as, what's going on here? What are we doing? If we're creating this reality, it's us creating the entire universe individually. And do you go with, do you know what I'm trying to get at? Are you for simulation theory? Does it merge or is it separate, or what's the ideas around that?
Well, the book is called Mind to Matter, The Astonishing Science of How Your Brain Creates Material Reality. And so there are ways in which your brain literally creates material reality, like the water, like the debris under the ledge. But there are also ways in which your brain does not create material reality. Like, for example, if I were to imagine a steamroller behind me, there would not be a steamroller behind me. I can imagine that all I want. I can meditate. I can get totally coherent. I can get into an elevated emotional state. I can meditate for a year, and I will not produce a steamroller in the same rooms. Highly, highly, highly unlikely. So there are things that are just not going to happen, mind to matter. And there are things that are definitely going to happen. If I think about the dog, I'm definitely going to have a rise in cortisol. Okay, so there are things that ways which I definitely create reality. The water experiments, other experiments like that, my body, my enzymes, my hormones, my neurotransmitters. That's a fact. Okay, but the steamroller, it's equally a fact. I am not going to create that steamroller in the room with me by thinking about it. So what I ask in the book, in the introduction to the book actually, is what's the middle ground? What's happening in the middle here? And I give an example in the introduction of the book. By the way, you can download the introduction free online at the website mindtomatter.club. We just put this up like 2 days ago. So there's the introduction and the first chapter for free at mindtomatter.club. And so if you go there, you can download the story amongst others. And so there are these two poles. There's the steamroller, you can't do that. There is the stress hormones, you can definitely do that with your mind. So what's the middle ground? So I tell the story in the introduction of the book. And the story is about how I went on vacation to Hawaii many years ago. And I love all the Hawaiian Islands. There's one island and one part of an island that I really love. And I rented a condo for a few days. I was working on a book. I had a deadline from a publisher to finish up this book. So I was working on this book in Hawaii, giving myself uninterrupted time to write in the condo. And then I'd go swimming in the bay outside, or I'd drive to one of the nearby beaches and I'd go swimming. So I rented a Jeep because some of the beaches in Hawaii are inaccessible except by four-wheel drive. So what I would do is I threw all my scuba diving and my snorkeling gear in the back of the Jeep. I would just drive the Jeep to wherever I was going. I'd go swimming there, maybe scuba diving or snorkeling. Then I'd drive back to the condo and ride. So I had this nice little thing going on there. And that particular day, I drove to a beach called Lauai Beach in Kauai, the island of Kauai. It's called beautiful Lauai Beach. Has a turtle colony living in a coral reef, maybe a quarter of a mile offshore. It's a long, very, very sheltered beach because of the reef out there. And so that particular day, I grabbed all my gear out of the back of the Jeep. I went for a long snorkel going all over Lauai Bay. And then eventually I decided to head back home. So I swam back to my entry point and I got out of the water, walked over to the Jeep to stow my gear, felt in my pocket for the car key, the Jeep key. My pocket was empty. I realized that at some point in my swim, I dropped the key. So I didn't panic. I thought, no big deal. I'll just retrace my steps. I'll walk back to the change room and look there. So I walked back to the change room and looked there. No key. Then I walked down to the beach and began to kind of shuffle through the sand to see if the key was there. Because not only was this the car key, I'd also clipped the condo key to that same key ring. So I couldn't get into my car and I couldn't drive anywhere and I couldn't open the condo without those keys. So there I was, stuck. And I realized the key wasn't any of those places. Then I looked at this huge expanse, about a square mile of this Lauai Bay, and thought, the key fell out of my pocket somewhere into the coral there, and it's about between 6 and 12 feet deep. So it's fairly deep in places. And so I thought, don't panic, just have the intention of finding the key and swim around the bay. So I went out there and I spent a long time just crisscrossing the bay back and forth. But then the light was failing. I was thinking, hey, some of that coral is 12 feet down. You're looking down at these coral beds. There are all kinds of holes in the coral. How will you find a tiny key ring in such a huge expanse? But again, I just had this feeling of softness and drawing the key back to me in my heart. But eventually I realized no matter how much you feel, this is just there's no way you're going to find a key ring in this massive expanse of this bay. So I thought it's time to admit reality, and I began to swim back to the beach. As I was swimming back, there was a father who had just entered the water with his 3 teenage sons. So the 4 of them had been swimming around there for just a few minutes as everyone else was leaving the beach. These guys were just entering and swimming around in the beach. And they were diving down and playing with each other, chatting on the surface. And as I swam by them, I waved to them and said, I noticed you guys diving to the bottom. Did anyone find anything down there? And the youngest boy held up a key ring. Now, these synchronicities, not just that day, it's over and over and over and over and over again in our lives. So we begin to wonder how our intentions affect reality. So that's the way in which I believe it happens. We set ourselves up for intentionality. We don't create the steamroller. We do create the hormones, and we create the circumstances of our lives in various ways. I'll give you one other little tiny short example. That's Walmart, the Walmart chain. And I'm not I don't like being in crowds, don't like being in big box stores, but every once in a while I go to Walmart. I used to have just a really negative attitude about Walmart. I just would, they were out of stock of something, I couldn't find something. I didn't like walking around the aisles. I didn't like all the energy there. I just basically would have a really, I felt a lot of the people who were supposed to be helping you either were totally absent or weren't helping you. But my wife would say to me, Dawson, practice being in your heart and being in a space of kindness and compassion in Walmart. So I thought, okay, if I can be in that state in Walmart, I can be there anywhere. So I began. And now, I go to Walmart nowadays every once in a while, and I enter that heart space, and I have a wonderful experience. I talk to the staff there if I need anything. People are so kind to me. I walked into the store the other day, and this person, I said, you know where the certain thing is? She said, I don't know where it is, but I'll go find the manager and I'll find it for you. And she did. The people are so sweet and kind to me. So that I changed it inside, and then my experience changed. If I had stayed in my interior state of thinking this is a horrible place, then I would have kept on creating that external experience. And we do. We create our experiences over and over and over again by our mental state. And to change our external experience out there, we have to change in here. Even though I may have had every single experience my whole life at Walmart, may have been a negative one, if I first create the reality in here of love and kindness and compassion and helpfulness and a good experience, even though I have no confirmation at all from the outside environment that that's true, then I will begin to create differently. But it starts in here. Start creating differently in here, and then you have the external reinforcement start to show up. But while you think the world is a certain way, you are unconsciously creating that kind of world out there, even though you think that's the way the world really is. It isn't. It's the way you are. And the way to change is to change inside here.
Amazing, brother. I totally agree. And I know that you do some work with athletes as well. And it's this fundamental when you deal with athletes. Let's say you want to learn a backflip. If you can't imagine what that's going to be like before you do it, there's no chance. You're probably going to fall on your head or whatever the case is. And it goes out into the world as well. So my question would be, of all the research that you've done, what does somebody do listening to apply what you've learned, to make it tangible, to bring it into their lives, to apply all this knowledge, to use, whether it's a technique or a strategy or it's a perspective? And the second thing is, where are the limits? So, you go into the law of attraction or Dr. Joe Dispenza's work or whatever the case is. And it's like, okay, Matt, I want to create this reality of, I don't know, the podcast is 10 million viewers a month around the world. It fully sustains me and I get helicopter rides, whatever craziness you can imagine in your mind that you're building your reality. And some of them are small, right? Sometimes it might be an improvement of a job. So that's more realistic to people, right? It's like, oh, maybe I can improve my job, and then they believe they can do it. But for me, it's like, it doesn't matter what the thing is. Maybe there's more of a time gap. So I'm curious, the applicable strategies of what you've learned, and do you see a limit to this, right? Like, can I be on a rocket ship going through outer space? Maybe that'll happen when I'm 90, but it's still possible.
Yeah, those good questions. And that question of how you change, what tactics, strategies, skills do you learn to use to change, that has been a question in human experience for tens of thousands of years. And 2,000 years ago, Jesus talked about loving kindness, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you. So Jesus talked about a change of heart. The Buddha talked about meditation, and he had a lot of other elements to his philosophy, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. But all these great teachers, Confucius, Lao Tzu, they all had some emphasis on inner stillness and inner peace and not being reactive. And that is an essential strategy you have to employ, is whatever it takes for you to not be reactive to your outside environment. If I keep reacting to the Walmart clerk and react the same predictable ways, then I'll stay the same person. And then in terms of tactics, the two I teach in Mind to Matter, I mentioned a whole bunch of them, but the two I really emphasize, one is meditation. I think meditation is the foundation of emotional regulation, and emotional regulation is the foundation of a peaceful life and the kind of coherence required for manifestation. In one of the studies I talk about in chapter 6 of Mind to Matter, these meditators were focused on changing the structure of the DNA molecule. Essentially, they had a test tube, a flask with human DNA in it, and they were asked to, DNA, of course, is a double helix, looks like a twisted piece of string, and you can measure the degree of twist. If you take the DNA and twist it more tightly, or you unravel it a little bit, you can measure the degree of twist of DNA using certain technologies. So what they were told to do was they were told to take this test tube of DNA and make it twist tighter. And so they were able to do that, but only if they were in this highly coherent state. People who had the intention of twisting the DNA without being coherent were unable to make any change in matter. So if you just have intentions, I want to be rich, I want to meet the woman of my dreams, I want to be in the marriage of I want to be with my soulmate, I want to live in this place, I want to make this money, blah, 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 blah. If you just have that intention, what research shows over and over again is that intention has almost no impact on the outside world. But when you're coherent, when your mind, when your intentions, when your heart, when your spirituality, when your energy field is completely coherent, you have the power of a laser. I talk about a light bulb. If you take a light bulb, ordinary 60-watt light bulb, that light travels maybe 6 or 8 feet away from the source. It dissipates very quickly. It uses over 90% of its energy in heat rather than light. Is not very effective. Take that same 60 watts, turn it into a laser, and make that light coherence, it'll cut through steel. So coherent light will cut through steel. Incoherent light will dissipate after a few yards. That's the same thing with our minds. We have to be coherent. When they had those coherent intenders intend for that DNA to twist tighter, it twisted tighter. When those coherent intenders intended the DNA to untwist, it twisted tighter. When they put 3 test tubes next to each other and told the intenders, twist the DNA tighter in only the middle test tube and leave the 2 neighboring test tubes untouched, that's exactly what happened. So again, these coherent states are what does this. And meditation is the way to acquire this kind of state. And I give you a technique called eco-meditation in Mind to Matter. So if you go to mindtomatter.club, there are all these links over there to eco-meditation, to tapping, all kinds of ways of getting coherent that I teach in the book. You have to do that. Now, the cool thing is, when you start to do this, when you start to meditate every day, when you tap regularly to release your stress, then you become much calmer. You have higher degrees of emotional regulation. Your emotional regulation increases. But I have an example in the first chapter of Mind to Matter. And in that chapter of Mind to Matter, I talk about the example of a guy called Graham Phillips. And he went on an 8-week mindfulness exercise. We learned and practiced mindfulness for 2 months. And these researchers at Monash University in Australia, where Graham Phillips lives, did a lot of tests on him before and after his 8 weeks of mindfulness. So he had his brain volume scanned using an MRI and an fMRI. So he had all kinds of testing done of his brain. Then again, in 2 months, he came back to the lab and they tested his brain again. And his cognitive function had increased dramatically. But when they ran his brain scans, they found that the emotional regulation part of his brain, this is part of the midbrain, the hippocampus, is called the dentate gyrus in the brain. His dentate gyrus had grown in volume in 8 weeks by 22.8%. That's almost a 23% increase in neural volume in the dentate gyrus. And the dentate gyrus is what helps develop emotional regulation and coordinate the brain for emotional regulation. So not only was his ability to regulate his emotions improving, but the hardware in his brain was changing as well. Mine was literally producing a change in matter. The software of meditation and calmness and mindfulness was producing a change in the hardware of his body. So you're literally shifting the hardware of your body by the software of your mind at every moment. So those are some of the things you can do. What the limits are, I suspect, Matthew, that we don't know the limits yet, because We're just starting this journey. We're just really discovering mindfulness on a big scale now. People are discovering tapping on a big scale now. I want millions and millions of people to get those benefits. My goal, if you go on my main website, it says we want to positively affect the lives of over 1 billion with a B people. Why should people keep on suffering from stress and anger and anxiety and depression and PTSD when we can show with our research all of these things are, if not curable in everyone, they're curable in most people. In our nonprofit, we've done 8 randomized controlled trials of veterans with PTSD, and it shows that in 84% of veterans that we treat, their PTSD symptoms are dramatically reduced, and they no longer have a PTSD diagnosis. Their flashbacks are gone, their nightmares are gone, their hypervigilance is gone. It's having a radical effect in 84% of veterans who go through our stress reduction program. So we have the ability now to deal with all of these mental health scourges like anxiety and depression that so bother people. And who knows, when millions of people can release their childhood trauma, when millions of people, when children, like for example, after the Sandy Hook massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, we and our friends of mine, colleagues of mine, we got volunteers. We had people going in there and working with the families of the traumatized kids. In Parkland, Florida, we did the same thing. We worked with over 20,000 veterans at this point, and we taught them to use these techniques to deal with their own PTSD. And when you start to give children these tools, and prisoners these tools, and veterans with PTSD these tools, and abused people these tools, suddenly all of the limitations on human capacity that the human race has struggled with for millennia, those things are just gone, and you're able to do that backflip because you no longer have anxiety. You're able to be kind to people around you because you're no longer being compelled by the conditioning of your past. Who knows what we as a human being, human race will achieve. But I know it'll be very different from what we would have accomplished had we not had this massive explosion in methods and tools that remove all these obstacles to human potential. So I think we're in for a profoundly positive future, but not one we can predict because, who could have predicted in 1795, who could have predicted that slavery would be gone in 30 years? It seemed impossible. There's a wonderful movie about that called Amazing Grace, which shows how like these 6 guys trying to abolish slavery kept on plugging away year after year, no effect, and suddenly, boom, it just happened. Women's suffrage, women getting the vote, women playing a part in the political discourse. That didn't happen for millennia. Suddenly, between New Zealand granting women the vote in 1896 and America in 1934, suddenly 50 years and women had the vote, and half of the human race came online politically in terms of their ability to influence human affairs. I mean, these massive changes, human societies are static for millennia, and suddenly, boom, they just jump, and we shift dramatically. So we're in the middle of one of those huge jumps in human civilization right now. That's the topic of a whole different talk, a whole different program. But that is where we are right now, and it's unpredictable. We have no idea where this jump will take us. We just do know that it's not linear. I talk in the book about linear processes in chemistry and physics and mathematics and human society. So things change bit by bit by bit by bit, incrementally. So you blow a balloon up and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Then it pops. That's a non-continuous event. You boil water, and the temperature gets a little bit higher and higher and higher and higher, and suddenly it bursts into boiling. A discontinuous event. We're in the middle of a discontinuous social event where we unlock human potential, and we start to be a whole different something than we would have before. That's non-continuous. It's not just evolution like this. It's some kind of vast tectonic change in human consciousness. We're right in the middle of it now. So I can't predict where that takes us, but I can tell you it will look nothing like our past.
That's amazing, brother. I totally agree. And you're coming at it with all the science, all your research as well. And it's coming to that kind of same conclusion for me. And I feel like a lot of others that we're moving in a positive direction. We can create a reality. And those are the fundamental things. The application is simple. So I want to ask, are those stress reducers for people who are in stress and they're in this loop? Meditation and EFT, I feel like those are your two big ones. I want you to touch on that. And then, because I know you have to leave, and that's why I wanted you to stay for as long as you'd like to go into the evolution of consciousness, maybe we'll have another one and we can explore that. I just wanted to ask you a super deep question, because I just had a big podcast with Truth Seeker, who grew up in the Bible Belt. And if you look outside that Bible Belt, if you look at anything different, and he started to look at things different, basically you would be considered the enemy. Don't look at that, because it becomes, whatever, the devil or something like that. So in your research, where do you fit God into this, that unforeseen force, that mystery? We're starting to affect our reality. We know that we create our own reality, but we're in this massive mystery that we know nothing about. So do you want to speak on that a little bit? And then I'll let you close out with your final thoughts, and go as long as you want. I'm just mindful of the time for you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. And so at the end of Mind to Matter, I talk about attunement with the infinite, because there's local mind, and my local mind says, my name is Dawson Church. Look, I have a driver's license to prove it. And I wrote a book called The Genie in Your Genes. I wrote this new book called Mind to Matter, and I have a cover and a publisher to prove it over here. So I have this local reality, and I'm 6'5", and I have gray hair. I have gray eyes and brown hair, and this is this local mind about who I think I am. You meditate for a while, and you get in touch with non-local mind, and you realize that you're tapping into this one great, magnificent universal consciousness. And the whole chapter on this very well understood phenomenon in physics called the observer effect, where when a phenomenon is observed, it then happens. If it isn't observed, it doesn't happen. But where I go in the book is I say, okay, we know that the physical world is dependent on the observer for its existence. So who's the observer? And the observer is non-local mind. The observer is consciousness itself. And consciousness comes to focus in my local mind. But if I live my life kind of cut off over here as though this is all I am, I'm going to have a very limited life. But if I meditate and get aligned with non-local mind, then suddenly consciousness, my local consciousness is to drop in the ocean, and I'm having this expansive experience. So all of these great figures, the Buddha and Muhammad and Jesus, and the various deities, the various prophets that are worshipped, what happened was that they had an experience. They aligned themselves with non-local mind. It's experience of the consciousness of the universe, and they describe all kinds of common phenomena. And again, in one chapter of the book, I describe what those phenomena are. One is you lose track of time and space. When you're Jesus doing the 40 days of wandering in the wilderness, when you're Muhammad on the night journey, when you're the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, then these great figures, they lose all track of time and space. They have a sense of timelessness and spacelessness. Now, what's interesting is that the part of the brain that processes spatial information and temporal information goes offline. We can now hook these people up when they're having these mystical experiences to an EEG, and we literally see that whole part of the brain shut down. Other parts of the brain to do with happiness and expansiveness light up. So the brain function starts to change when people have these mystical experiences. And so they go to the mountaintop. Moses goes to Mount Sinai and has this experience of being face to face with God. But what happens then is interesting. They come down from the mountaintop, or like Jesus, they come out of the wilderness, or like John the Baptist, they show up in their daily life. And then they try to explain this to other people. And then other people say, wow, look at that guy. He's wearing a saffron robe. So saffron robes must be really important. Let's all wear saffron robes. He's wearing a blue flower in his shirt. That must be a blue flower. It's got to be really important. Sandals. Oh God, sandals. We've got to have those. Oh, and he did it in the deserts. We have to go to the desert. We have to go to Mount Sinai. We have to go to the Himalayas. We have to meditate in a monastery. Oh, he was meditating for 6 years. Oh, everyone has to meditate for 6 years. So they then look at the trappings in which the person had the mystical experience, and they make a religion out of it. So these mystics all are having the same experience of oneness with non-local consciousness, one with infinite intelligence. They're all there. They come back and try to explain it to people around them, and they then get a religion made out of that experience that is anchored to the dress, the culture, the language, the concepts of that era. And so the religions all look different to each other, but what they share is that mystical experience. What I talk about in Mind to Matter is that now, with modern equipment like MRIs and EEGs, we can map what's going on in the brain. And whereas before it took this person 6 years of meditation or 40 days in the wilderness to get to that state, that elevated state, now, because we know what their mind map looks like, their brain map looks like, we can show people how to achieve that state in a few minutes. And it's amazing. When I do meditation retreats, we guide people. The first day takes them about 4 minutes to enter that state, not very long, because we reverse engineered it now. And so we have people in that state in 4 minutes. By the end of the third day, it's 90 seconds, minute and a half, they can acquire that state. And what's more is that state is no longer a religious or spiritual state only reserved for people who are mystics. That state is now being used. Some of the people who run Google use this. Nike's innovation team uses this. Red Bull's executive suite uses this. The Navy SEALs have just built a massive complex in Norfolk, Virginia called the Mind Gym, where they train Navy SEALs to enter the state. The Navy SEAls call it ecstasis, like the word ecstasy, but IS on the end, ecstasis, where they train them to enter the state of ecstasis. In ecstasis, they are measuring what our brains do and then what they look like in ecstasis and how we perform. Our creativity doubles in ecstasis. Our ability to handle complex and ambiguous information more than quadruples in ecstasis. So all of these super performance abilities in athletes, in executives, in high performers occur. So what used to be reserved for the monastery, the desert fathers, the saints, the mystics, is now being used by the Olympic athletes, is being used by the high-performing executive, is being used by somebody like the Navy SEALs that do a lot of hostage rescue situations. They don't want to kill anybody or hurt anybody, but they want to get the hostages out. And so very, very difficult situations like that, they enter ecstasis. They then, in that state, are able to perform these very complex dynamic calculations. So that's really where we as human beings are going. It's no longer the province of the mystics. It's now something, it's a formula, and you can just learn it and apply it and be there and basically spend most of your daily life in that wonderful, happy, mystical state. Whether you're an office worker or whether you're in a department store or whether you're in a cubicle, you can learn to train yourself to be there and make that your reality.
Incredible answer, brother. I appreciate this whole conversation. Is there a link that someone can go through? Is it a guided meditation, or how do they access that? Because I'm curious and I want to do it, so I'm sure other people are. And
yes.
Any final thoughts? And if you want to keep going on anything, you're more than welcome. And where people can get a hold of you.
Okay, so the book you can order at the book's website, Mind to Matter, and that's .club, .club. It's not .com, it's .club, mindmatter.club. And there you'll find, like, I'll be doing a bunch of book signings in the next while. I'll be doing a bunch of live events. All of those links are at mindmatter.club, as well as how to get the book, where to get the book, and you have to pre-order the book. It's not out yet, but you can pre-order the book there and get a whole bunch of cool bonuses, including that eco meditation routine. So you'll find information in the book. And then if you want to just get the meditation, that's also free on the web. And that is at ECO. Actually, no, go to this one. A better website to go to is Dawson, my name, DAWSON, Dawson, gift, GIFT.com, because that site has both eco meditation and also a free tapping manual. So you get both of those at one location. So either go to DawsonGift.com for the meditation, the tapping manual, and a bunch of other things, or to pre-order the book, go to mindtomatter.club.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Definitely come back so we can go down the rabbit hole and explore the evolution of consciousness. I appreciate all of your work, what you're doing, and who you are, man. Thanks so much.
Bless you. Thank you. And I'd love to be back.
Take care, guys. Didn't even know what hand sign. See ya.